Hello, everyone, and welcome to weeks 8 and 9 of this course. So remember that this week and next are meant to be lighter. You can either do the focus questions for week 8 or week 9. You're not required to do both, but if you choose to do both, I will give you extra credit equivalent to a week's worth of focus questions, which might be a good deal if you're missing some focus questions, which some of you are. Okay, so over the next 2 weeks, this will be the presentation, and there will be one discussion board. So if you feel like you don't need a break here, you know, I would recommend starting on your second paper. That deadline will come up quickly, and I want to make sure you're able to do it well. So this week, let me shrink a little bit, show you my intro slide. I'm combining a lot of things, but one of the things I decided to put front and center on this slide, at least, is the War of 1812. And my joke, of course, is that it wasn't just a war in 1812. It took a while to fight out. But this is a conflict that is sometimes doesn't feature largely in our curriculum. Lepore almost completely ignores it. So I'm really curious to see your thoughts on why you think she just brushes over the War of 1812. For the 200-year anniversary in 2012, Canada came out with some commemorative coins for the conflict, because in Canada, they don't see it as a sort of second revolution or attempt to overthrow American independence. They see it as an American attempt to conquer Canada and a Canadian defense of their right to exist independently of the United States. And so in 2012, they came out with commemorative coins. The conservative Harper government did, and what was funny is that many Canadians were like, "Whoa, why are we making a big deal out of this? We really don't need to be doing this. What are you trying to rub it in the face of the Americans or something?" But the coins are available. Who knows? Maybe some of you have them. All right. So last week, where can I put myself? Right down there. All right, last week I got into some of the early debates between Federalists and Republicans, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. I did the week before too. So many of the discourses surrounding how Federalists and Republicans imagine the new American nation can be somewhat better understood if we look at a global context. So Federalists in particular were a party that wanted a rational basis for the establishment of good governance by they were fuzzy on this part, but somewhat aristocratic, educated, republic-minded group of elites. Republicans, on the other hand, were inspired by transnational discourses, especially coming out of the French Revolution, that and they felt like power should come from and reside in the people themselves. And certainly Federalists didn't deny that idea, but they were leery of it. So nationalism then is a belief in the superiority of your people. But the way nationalists have defined the people can vary drastically. And I got into this a little bit last week as well. So Federalists would often point to these hypocrisies, as in the campaign literature. Oh, sorry. So Republicans, for the most part, did not see African descended and native peoples as part of "quote unquote" the people. So Federalists would point to these hypocrisies in their campaign literature. For instance, maligning Thomas Jefferson for his relationship with the woman he enslaved, Sally Hemings. Federalist opposition was often more about showing the hypocrisy of the Republicans than it was about maybe offering a better vision than what the Republicans were offering as well. And so I'm and that this campaign propaganda, it went both ways. So I'm going to segue into the French Revolution a bit. So the French Revolution drew inspiration from the American, and that inspiration was a two-way street. In many respects, the French Revolution inspired, and I've got some key talking points about the French Revolution on this slide, the little red box. So the French Revolution also inspired the Americans, especially who were still unsure in their new government. The French Revolution inspired Republicans, while terrifying most Federalists. Its origin story is generally written as being similar to the American and the previous Pugachev revolts that we talked about in class, but with resistance to taxes being early key motivators. But a key difference between the French and American revolutions was that the French revolutionaries wanted to transform society, not just government. And they kind of actively spread their revolution as well in their conflicts with the rest of Europe. the Americans did as well in their conflicts with native peoples and later the Spanish. So the French wanted their revolution to mark the beginning of a new era, while many, not all Americans, were often just rebelling against the violation of already well-defined rights that they felt they had as English subjects, as Englishmen. So the irony of slavery was less of a problem for the French too. While they drew tremendous wealth from slaves in the Caribbean and the exploitation of India, there were no slaves in France. Black people in Europe generally didn't have to deal with the kinds of racism that had developed for black people living in the English North American colonies, all of the Atlantic, the Spanish colonies as well, but especially the English North American colonies or the young United States of America. So this racism would come to Europe later, once their imperialism over Africa occurred. I certainly don't mean to imply that there are no racists in Europe. So for many Americans, though, it's trying to switch slides. Where can I put myself? How about right there? No, I'll keep myself out of this slide. All right, so for many Americans, the French Revolution signified a more activist style of government, one where the people of all walks had a stake. So in August of 1789, for example, the French passed their Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen, which in part inspired the American Bill of Rights, which was proposed 1 month later. The Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen, along with the American Declaration of Independence and the earlier English Bill of Rights, became foundations for liberalism as the entire world entered into an era of revolutions during the subsequent 19th century. This illustration from the period, this is French again, shows the power of one institution for the revolution in particular, the army. The Marquis de Lafayette, the same person who convinced the monarchy to become involved in America's war against England, who led French troops fighting in the American Revolution, organized the National Guard in 1789, the French National Guard. This French army really foreshadowed what successful modern militaries would become. Institutions of state building meant to foster nationalism. The two men in the illustration are seen being transformed from ordinary to extraordinary, with free alcohol to boot. To me, it's got the same feel as a modern military recruitment poster. In this picture, they are gaining national consciousness or becoming French. So nationalism, that very word, was most clearly defined for the rest of the world in the French Revolution. In France, people learned to speak the same dialect of Parisian French, to sing their anthem, the Marseillaise, to have pride in their flag, and to significantly modify their personal lives for the sake of the nation as a whole, because they were proud of their own nation. This nationalism made the French fight and produce so much better, and it absolutely inspired the Americans in their new nation. I don't mean to laud it. It becomes a very dirty thing as well. So in this slide, I just want to shift gears a little bit. Here, can I put myself? I'll be right up there next to Herder. And show some of the early 19th century German thinkers who took French ideas of nationalism, especially when the area of Prussia they lived in was occupied by Napoleon's armies, and began to argue that nationalism, or a world full of governments that represented the aspirations of specific ethnic groups, was the best way to have a world of peace and prosperity. As Germans, they lived in a world where they were constantly at war according to the whims of whatever their rulers wanted. Remember, there were lots of Germans who fought in the American Revolution on the side of the British, Hessian mercenaries. There was also no state that unified all German speakers. So Herder on the left believed a remedy to this kind of oppression was German pride. If people could read and write in German, celebrate their own traditions, and eventually have a republic for all Germans, Germans would be able to be fulfilled as a people. German speakers were divided into many different countries. They wanted something more unified like the United States of America or the Gran Colombia of Simón Bolívar. And remember, so many German soldiers, they saw what the United States of America was becoming, and they wanted that. Herder, he believed that if everyone lived in a nation state of their own ethnicity, the world would be peaceful. He would have reeled in horror at what German nationalists would do later in the 19th century and especially in the 20th century. So on the right side, you've got the Brothers Grimm, who went around collecting folk tales for the sole purpose of building a canon of the wisdom of the people. They absolutely inspired people like Noah Webster, who wrote the Webster Dictionary of trying to catalog American speech. So for the Brothers Grimm, real wisdom didn't come from universities and elites, it came from ordinary people. Again, so many people looked at the young American Republic as inspiration for what they would like to see happen in Germany or anywhere else in the world. I mean, I'm just giving these examples because they're rather contemporaneous to nationalism in the young United States of America. So at the same time, many Germans were becoming a significant immigrant group to the United States, bringing these ideas with them. But as I mentioned last week, the whole idea of what a nation is, I mean, this was a brand new idea. Nationalism was a new word in the early 1800s, and that's one of the reasons why when national was used in the United States, especially as we'll read by week 10, it really meant the country as a whole. And to be able to try and put some sort of ethnic component to it, well, that would often happen through exclusion, like the idea that Irish people couldn't possibly be American, stuff like that. Turns out they can. So nation, we are unique in world usage in that we use nation to be synonymous with the country. Like I mentioned last week, if I want to go see the nation, I'm talking about traveling the country. It's not used that way in other countries, other contexts. All right. So last week, I'm using the wrong mouse. Come on, switch. All right. Last week, when we talked about the debates between Federalists and Republicans, one of the things that I hope was clear to you was a considerable amount of both overlap and inconsistency in their positions. Republicans were all about suffrage, except for women, natives, and black people. Federalists were opposed to slavery, except when they weren't, and they were dependent on its resources for industrialization. What the original founders had hoped for was a system of checks and balances that could create a sort of inertia that would prevent radical ideas from undermining the slow, steady progress of Republican ideals in the young country. So when Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States, the Supreme Court had a rather poor reputation and was sort of the forgotten stepchild of the federal government. Laporte's got some great descriptions of the court as just about the least desirable place of employment. One of the things John Adams did before he left office was to appoint a bunch of circuit judges that were Federalists in their leanings to try to frustrate Jefferson's efforts to roll back federalism. It's a sneaky trick that happens all the time in American history. We saw that very recently as well. So one of these appointments, a person named William Marbury, didn't receive his commission before Adams left office, and Jefferson decided not to deliver it since he knew Marbury was a Federalist. So Marbury took the case against Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Madison had broken the law, not delivering the commission, but then shockingly ruled that the law giving the Supreme Court jurisdiction over Marbury's case was not in line with the intent of the Constitution. So he struck down the law, and Marbury didn't get his job. So this established the principle of judicial review, that the Supreme Court has the right to judge the constitutionality of laws passed by the legislative and executive branches. So, I have a pose a question here. Is this a check on government, a necessary check, or is it judicial overreach? So another example of, oops, here, I'll go behind the oxen here. Another example of changing notions of the role of government that occurred under the Republicans' watch was the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase was enormously popular despite the overreach of federal power, which Jefferson used to the complaint of Federalists, who were otherwise in favor of land acquisition, politics as usual. So it was enormously popular. Yet the opportunity to gain an empire, to be able to have enough land to expand almost indefinitely in the mind of Jefferson, was too good an opportunity to pass. So I got a little bit of details here about the Louisiana Purchase. You've certainly heard of it before, but had it not been for the Haitians successfully fighting off the French, then Napoleon probably wouldn't have been motivated to just give up all French claims to North America and sell them for, pennies on the acre to the young United States of America. All right, so by 1807, I'll put myself up with these ruffians here. The Napoleonic Wars were in full swing, and the United States was again in conflict with the French and British. The British had begun to search and the British and French were fighting against each other. So the British had begun to search U.S. ships trading with France and impressing Americans as seamen again. Napoleon's forces had been wildly successful in joining large areas of Europe to the French continental system of political and economic cooperation, but he had gotten bogged down on the Iberian Peninsula fighting against Spain and Portugal, in part inspired by the Haitians who had already secured their independence and were ironically supported by Federalists, but opposed by supposedly freedom-loving Republicans who feared that what freed slaves might make their own slaves think. Spanish and Portuguese speaking South and Central America also rose up in this period. So, over the next decade, new states from Mexico all the way to Argentina emerged, which most Americans felt enormously excited about. Um, so, as these conflicts of the mid 1800s heated up, put myself with Gane there. Well, Thomas Jefferson was still president. His response, showing really no awareness of how economies work, was to pass the Embargo Act, which closed American ports to all British and French shipping. This, of course, had a disastrous effect on the American economy. When Madison became president, his modification to the Embargo Act was the Non-Intercourse Act, basically a promise to open up trade with whomever stopped harassing American shipping first. Napoleon was the first, though continued attacking U.S. shipping, while the British angered many Americans due to continuing activity along the frontier, and again impressing seamen, basically kidnapping people in port cities and forcing them into the Royal Navy. Oh, I'm sorry, this slide doesn't match. So, anyways, one of the problems that emerged late in George Washington's presidency was just the America's inability to remain neutral in the early French Revolution. So, Citizen Gane, I mean, this is long before Napoleon, was the French ambassador to the United States who was secretly recruiting pirates, American privateers, to harass British shipping. So the British retaliated. They attacked U.S. shipping and they attacked frontier forts. So fearing, getting sucked into a conflict he wanted nothing to do with, Washington was able to sign a treaty, Jay's Treaty, in 1794, which agreed to having the British evacuate their western forts, meant simply to harass the United States, to reimburse Americans for seized ships, and to let Americans trade in the British West Indies in exchange for an American embargo on France of military goods and a refusal to equip French pirates. So this led to an early conflict with France called the Quasi War, where the French plundered 300 American ships, and the XYZ affair of 1796, which was a failed bribe by the French to the Americans that almost led to open war. So the Americans, they captured 100 French ships and then signed a treaty. So even before the Napoleonic Wars, I'm sorry that I forgot about this slide. Even before the Napoleonic Wars, you had open on the sea conflict with both the French and the English, and it was really ugly. So there are other ways. Oops. Okay, so and again, the Republicans who generally favored the French did not want war with them, and the Federalists who generally favored the English didn't want war with them either. So when John Adams became president in 1797, his fear of French agents undermining the American Republic caused him to enact some of the most sorry, I've got to. Oops. Here we go. Some of the most anti-democratic pieces of legislation in American history, ones that have been mimicked many times since. So when Adams took office, the quasi-war with France was still ongoing. So he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which lengthened the residency requirement to become a citizen, The fear was that lots of French spies were going to become U.S. citizens, vote for Republicans, and undermine the rational federalist control of the United States of America. We hear these kind of arguments all the time in American history, that if immigrants might vote differently than whoever is in power. So he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the more controversial part for most Americans was the Sedition Acts, allowing the president to jail people for seditious statements against the government in this time of emergency. So by this period, Napoleon was already first consul of France, quickly on his way to becoming emperor, and Americans were more divided than ever in their support of / fear of the French Revolution. A couple years ago, I asked people in class, if their town has a Lafayette Street, and those people from all over New York basically all raised their hands and said yes. Just one little remnant of how much Americans liked the Marquis de Lafayette, and how much so many Americans, especially in upstate New York and the city as well, appreciated what was happening with the revolution. Okay. Now I screwed up my slides a little bit. Okay, so we've had Citizen Gane. All right, here we are. All right, so in the period after the Quasi-War with France, before Americans really got involved in the Napoleonic Wars against the British, there was a brief. No, I'm screwed up again. Here we go. I'm sorry. There was a brief overseas military invasion that foreshadowed many such interventions in the coming century. So in the early 1800s, the U.S. went to war in support of trade on the high seas. Those states that had patrolled the Mediterranean, forming kind of a protection racket, were labeled pirates by the U.S. and attacked. So the United States sent Marines across the ocean in 1805 to attack Tripoli, which is modern-day Libya, and Algiers, which is the capital of Algeria. And these defeats by American forces really devastated these regions and led to their eventual colonization under the French and Italians, and the next stage of imperialism that would subdue Africa for decades. So nasty consequences and a precedent for using the military on behalf of business interests. This little intervention also provided the lyrics for the first stanza of the Marines' anthem, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. So there were politicians in the run-up to the War of 1812 who were called hawks. They wanted war with Britain. John Calhoun, Henry Clay wanted war with Britain so they could seize Canada. Calhoun and Clay felt like new land was key to unifying Federalists and Republicans. If only there was more land, industry and farmers would be happier. So in response to these outrages, Congress, so outrages like having their shipping seized, and especially people, Americans being impressed into the Royal Navy, which are outrages, don't get me wrong. Congress and the Republican president Madison declared war in 1812. Federalists were largely against the wars. They felt the U.S. should be on the side of England against tyrannical Napoleonic France. What was interesting is that Republicans who were against industry and feared a central government and military spending now had to fight a war. So in the memory of the war, Republicans often emphasized the fighting skills of American frontiersmen. In reality, the victory in battles like New Orleans came from American artillery, produced in Philadelphia foundries, showing the innovations of American engineering and industry. The war as a whole involved an attempt to conquer Canada. It was rebuffed. Battles on the frontier, on the Great Lakes, and the American burning of the Canadian capital, and retaliatory British burning of the American capital. The war was really a draw, where the British lost the will to fight once the Napoleonic Wars were over, and Americans realized they didn't have the willpower to attain their original goals. So again, I find it interesting that Lepore basically ignores this war. So one group that you're... oh, sorry, and I had a slide on the War of 1812, so just some... You can jump back to this slide. Very out of sync today, I apologize for that. So pause here if you'd like, and I have this on Banquo Hall as well. Okay. One group that your Lepore reading deals with in more depth, which I appreciate, is the American Colonization Society, though in a manner that I think can be a little difficult to follow. So she doesn't explicitly define what they did, but mentions them in passing throughout the chapter. So the American Colonization Society was basically a group hoping to send, and that's chapter 5, all African descended people back to Africa. It's been long derided for the racist assumption that free black people don't belong in America or didn't belong in America. And it was also supported through a coalition of white people who wanted to end slavery, so good guys, and slaveholders. Those wanting to end slavery figured that if they could at least get some people sent to Africa, they'd have better lives than in the racist United States. Those who owned the enslaved, worried that free black people would inspire slave revolts, and they figured sending black people to Africa would make their remaining slaves more valuable. James Madison was among those who thought this way. So these explanations, while true, ignore the role that black people had in forming the society. One of the founders, painted here, I was going to say pictured here, painted here, was Paul Cuffey. He was a black man who was part of the early meetings to form the society. He was a successful ship captain with an all-black crew who had been trying to help Africans build economies that weren't dependent on slave trading. He ultimately decided that sending African Americans to Africa wasn't a tenable idea. They were Americans, after all. But the American Colonization Society did have the support of Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, AME, which would later become a pivotal center of abolitionism and the Underground Railroad. He actually helped purchase the land that would become the colony of Liberia. Between 1816 and 1865, roughly 8,000 people from the United States voluntarily emigrated to Liberia. Most African Americans then and now felt like the idea was nothing but an attempt to force people away from their homes to a foreign continent. Okay, that's a lot on the early republic. Here's some fun bonus questions for you. Get my face out of the way. And hope you enjoy your weeks. Good luck with everything. Talk to you all later.